Hey all, welcome to NX After Dark. It is not quite after dark here in Denmark yet, but the sun has set, so it's dusk right now, a quarter to 9 p.m. Today we're going to stop for a second on the implementation of the CO2 forecast feature on the Energy Insights Angular app using an NX workspace, because we have covered it quite well with unit tests, and now it's time to look for the integration tests. As if you've been following since the beginning, we actually removed Cypress, which is the default end-to-end testing framework. So let's see what we can do with integration testing instead. We're actually going to be using the Angular testing library together with a testing library for Angular integration testing that I have created called Spectacular. But those two work hand in hand, at least for the feature testing API of Spectacular. So let's go have a look at that. Here is our Energy Insights app, and the code, as always, is on GitHub. Just find me on GitHub, and should be good to go. We're working still in this CO2 forecast feature. Let's have a look here at NX dependency graph. Let me find the browser. This is what it currently looks like. We're still missing these implicit dependencies between the assets and the styles workspace libraries, but we are starting here to see the layers of our application, the app project right here, the forecast feature, which then depends on domain interfaces, the data access layer, which has the component store and the HTTP client inside of it, which then uses a utility library for date times. So what we're going to be testing, or rather the feature testing API of Spectacular, looks at what's known as a feature module from Angular, a routed feature module rather, and takes that as the kind of the scope of what do we want to test. Here's the place where we cut. And a feature module in an Angular would contain, the module is kind of the, how can you say that, like the code splitting boundary for an Angular application. So the feature module will really give access to everything below this project in the dependency graph. So also the data access and the domain and the utilities. All of that we can exercise in our Spectacular feature test, the integration test. But it stops there. We're stopping everything outside of these projects. So either we're actually putting it inside of an application, but not this application, a testing application, using the test bed, or rather using the Angular testing library together with Spectacular to set up the Angular test bed. So it's being bootstrapped as if this feature module was everything there was available in that application. Then we can interact with the application through the DOM. We can click buttons, we can inspect elements, we can route, navigation, all of that. But we will stop at when we reach a request to the server, for example, the HTTP client, which is down here. Hello, Jordan. Nice of you to join, even though you used to hate videos. So this is where we have a decision to make. Should we continue or allow our HTTP client inside of this data access library? Should we allow that to send an HTTP request? If yes, then we could, let's say the HTTP request goes here, just to demonstrate or visualize it. So here's the server, like a real, in this case, it's an external API, but a public one that we're calling the Energy Data Service in Denmark. So we are going to intercept that request here. We could use, for example, the library called mock service worker, or MSW. With that, we could set up kind of a testing HTTP server. I guess it's install as a service worker, hence the name. I think. Tim DeSchrijver, who's the creator of the Angular testing library, is also helping support the mock service worker and has created the Angular examples for that. But anyways, we could use this to actually allow our app to send real HTTP requests, but intercept them in the kind of the pipeline, the HTTP request pipeline. But another option, and one that I mean, that's what you would want to do if you were doing an end-to-end test. Either you'd use mock service worker, or maybe like in Cypress, there's a way to intercept HTTP requests as well. In the when we're using the test bed, which Angular testing library, Spectacular, and other Angular testing libraries, behind the scenes, they're all calling the test bed. So we have this Angular testing module, which means we can replace certain services with what we call a stopped or a fake or a spy or a mock service that is only for the purpose of testing. So we could do the same here. Inside of this data access library, we have our own HTTP client that calls this Energy Data Service API. And we could replace either that service, but then we wouldn't be testing the code of that service, which is our code. So maybe instead we could choose to use the HTTP testing API from Angular. So those are the kind of the decisions we have. Should we use the HTTP testing utilities from Angular? They're kind of a not very. They're a bit complicated to use. So an easier option would be to replace the kind of the response from the HTTP client, our own HTTP client for the CO2 prognosis emission dataset. But then we wouldn't be touching that code and exercising that code in the integration test. So it's a bit of a trade-off. The third option would be to use mock service worker, but since I don't know how to use that, I'm not going to do that today, because I want to focus on what I do know today, which is Spectacular and the Angular testing library. So yeah, we'll have another look once we have the tests to see where we're going to stub out a dependency, or say this is the boundary that defines what we want to test and what we want to replace with fake code. This is the Spectacular package. It's in the ng worker namespace or NPM organization. This is the open source group I'm a part of that also has the Lumberjack logging library for Angular and a few other projects in the making. For example, we also have the Angular versions action for a GitHub action for trying out things with certain versions of Angular, similar to the setup node task or action from GitHub themselves. We have the Angular versions action, which allows us to, for us, it allows us to test Lumberjack with many different versions of Angular, every major and minor version since 9.0, and all the related TypeScript versions. We also have it set up for many Node versions and so on. And that's the same thing. I want to give that same level of confidence for Spectacular, but the Angular testing action or Angular version action does not support NX workspaces yet. It only supports Angular CLI workspaces, which is why Spectacular is still in version 0.2.0, because I haven't verified that it works with other versions than Angular 11. But today we're going to use Angular 12, so at least we'll know. But I'm pretty sure it'll work with many versions of Angular. But I want the pipeline to be able to say it for sure, like have verified support. And for that, we're going to need support in the Angular versions action for an NX workspace, because Spectacular lives in a monorepo using the NX toolchain. So this is the one of the testing libraries for Angular we're going to use, my testing library. And the other one is the, let's see here, search for it, the Angular testing library. This is part of the testing library family of libraries. It's created by Kent C. Dodds, and Tim of the NGRX team is maintaining the Angular flavor of that. So this is the package name at testing-libraries/Angular. And here's the GitHub repo. There's also there's a Discord server for all the testing libraries, and there's a channel for the Angular flavor where you can come and say hi to Tim and me and a few other people. So yeah, there's not a lot of documentation in here because very little of this library is Angular specific. A lot of it is depending on the core library here, the DOM testing library. But what is Angular specific here is these three that normally in other frameworks you would import them from the DOM testing library or the React or whatever. So I guess it's the same here from the Angular testing library. And what's special about the Angular version is this render function. You pass it a component, and then you're going to have some Angular specific options here, such as the component properties, the input properties. And then yeah, we'll get to this, but basically then we can fire click events, we can inspect elements on the screen. So all of this is that's exactly what this library is for. But as you can see, it's focusing on a single component, so and isolating the world outside of that component. But what I wanted to be able to do was test a whole feature, like a whole area of an application, and say, yeah, I want to test this whole domain behind this Angular routed Angular feature module with all the components, all the services, everything inside of that feature, not just this one component. So Spectacular sits as a thin glue layer on top of Angular testing library. Well, it's not really wrapping the Angular testing library, but you'll see very soon. It's helping to configure the test bed behind the scenes by passing some options from Spectacular to the Angular testing library. So it's not really a hacky way. It's just, or should never say just, because to me it's simple because I built the library, right? But it's passing some special options. It's registering some routes for the router testing module. It's registering some modules. It's registering a component that will be the root component for this testing application. And it will have a router outlet so that it's able to render all the routes inside of that feature. So not just one route, not just one component, but a whole chunk of the application, basically. Everything that would be inside of a lazy loaded chunk, that's what we're going to test. And now that we're starting to see that we have an application, it's still very early for this feature, but it's enough that we can already start to see how this could be helpful. Let's quickly fire up the app here to see just remind ourselves what we have and what we don't have. Because the next step was actually to, so it's not done yet. The next step was to, now we have the raw data and we have displayed it in a very rudimentary HTML table, but we actually want to show it in a graph. So that's the next step implementation-wise. For that, we made sure that we have covered everything that makes sense to cover with unit tests. And now let's see what we can do with integration tests. So this is the app right now. This is the CO2 forecast feature. Everything we see here inside of this main area. So this is our HTML table with the date and timestamp, the grams of CO2 equivalent, greenhouse gases emitted per kilowatt hour produced in the Danish electricity grid, the price area. There's DK1, which is Western Denmark, DK2, which is Eastern Denmark, But for this data set right now, the values are always the same because they're actually an average across the two price areas. They will hopefully be split out at some point so that you have the exact number per area here, per price area. Yeah, but this is a lot because it's 5 minutes intervals. As you can see, there's a new value per price area per 5 minutes. And we're able to see, depending on the time of day, we're able to see the current day, which is May 26th, and the following day, which is May 27th here, and all the way up to midnight tomorrow, Danish time. So this is a lot of data, right? So we want to put that in a chart so that it's easier visualized and you can get a good overview. And what can you use this for? I intended to be used by private persons to see in which hours would it be good for me to run my washing machine, my dryer, my dishwasher, which hours of the night would be the most climate friendly, and those hours would usually also be the cheapest. We pay there's a price per hour in the Danish and the European electricity grid. So they go hand in hand, usually, the climate friendly with the price friendly. So yeah, instead of having a smart grid, you'll just have a smartphone with an app. I'm going to turn it into a PWA hopefully at some point so that you can pull it out of your pocket and maybe go further than a chart, and instead just like a message saying which hours would be the best for me to run my appliances during the night, right? And it would say the hours between 2 and 4 are the most climate friendly. The hours between 4 and 5 are the most economical, and so on. Something like that. That would be great. So what can we test here? We can test that the user is able to see all these data points, and for both price areas, for every minute in the two days we have displayed and data available, like the current day from midnight and the following day until the end of that day, so 5 minutes before midnight. Every time here represents the start of an interval. So this value here applies to the time between 12:00 midnight and 12:05, and then another interval starts and from 05 to 10. So that's the way it works. Okay, so we will be how can I say it, like stuffing in some test data for, say, at some point during the day before 3 p.m. Danish time. We only have 1 day's data available, so we could give it some test data for 1 day, and then make sure that everything is displayed to the user, or maybe just some of it, and for both price areas. We can maybe have a scenario where we have data for both days, so that would be in the afternoon or evening. You would have data for the following day, and we'll see that data flows all the way through the UI to the user. Other than that, there's not really a lot of interactivity going on right now. It's simply presentation. Well, except for the fact that every minute it will ask for new data, and it will do it initially as well, because if you've been following along, you might have remembered that we put in an effect using NGX Component Store. So there's an effect being triggered when the service is constructed, and then every minute following that, where it will be requesting new data. Because as you might have guessed, these data, it's updated, well, at least every 5 minutes, but in some cases every few minutes even, all the way throughout the day. And then at 3 p.m., around 3 p.m. in the afternoon, then we get the data set for the following day. And that will also be a preliminary numbers that will be updated, because these numbers it's a forecast, right? So it can't be precise. So it'll be adjusted accordingly throughout the day, for example, based on the weather forecast, based on the trades, or maybe a power plant has run out of like run out of production, or maybe a power cable has been cut or something, that would certainly affect these numbers, because the CO2 emission level is, of course, based on, what's the energy sources? Is it solar? Is it wind? Or are we going to need enough power that the solar and wind cannot cover it? So we have to turn up the traditional fossil fuel-based power plants. Let's just for fun have a look today on the current numbers here also, even though they were the real numbers, what we just saw. But here we have the chart for the next 8 hours. So right now we're at 9 p.m. and it goes to 4 p.m. here. So yeah, from 4 to 5, right? So that will be 8 hours. Everything below 80 is, or 80 max grams per kilowatt, would be considered green. So this is going to be a green electricity night in Denmark. So time to turn up those washers and dryers anytime here between 11 and 5 a.m. 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. would be good. A good interval to run your appliances at home, or charge your EV or whatever. Charge your laptops, charge your phones, all of that. And right now, the last hour was covered by 53% wind and solar. And it's certainly not a lot of solar because the sun has set, and even though it's not fully dark yet, like in the Nordics, there's not a lot of sun, right? I mean, the sun goes down early and the sun is at a difficult angle. So unless you have the solar panels that can adjust to the sun, you're only going to get much solar power like in the daytime hours. Certainly not early morning or late at night. Not a lot, though. Okay, so this is our domain. This is our app right now. This is the feature, the CO2 forecast feature. And we might have to adjust the app a bit, because right now it's not really well. Okay, let me think about that for a second. Right now we have this feature, forecast feature, and it has a feature module right here, or where is it? Here it is. That is exporting the SCAM, so the single component Angular module of the CO2 forecast container component, because right now it is being used here in our application as an element. So there is no routes involved. So we might have to turn this into something more realistic, more best practice, actually lazy loading the feature so that it will be a separate chunk. So that's actually what we're going to do first. So how are we going to do this? Several options. The first, for sure, is we could create. Yeah, maybe it's time to do a shell. Or that might be too early, right? But in a domain, I would have a shell module, a shell Angular module, a shell library, and that will contain the routes and the entry point component for this feature. But yeah, that'll come later. That's another concept we'll have to dive into at some point when the application grows. Right now, let's see here. We're going to need some routes. We could do that in a separate routing module, but let's just keep it simple right now. So we're going to need some routes from Angular router. And yeah, hello, Matteo. Thank you for joining. I know you have been asking about Spectacular, and there's not much documentation right now. There's a very basic API reference. There's some inline documentation, which I think is also important. But there's not really a full example. I mean, there is an integration spec that for a very complicated one, even for the Tour of Heroes routing tutorial inside of the Spectacular GitHub repo. So that's showing how Spectacular works just with the test bed without an additional testing library. There's actually also a branch where I was figuring out how to use it with Angular testing library. So you might want to look into that branch. But otherwise, yeah, there's some advanced use cases inside of there. I've done a few videos about Spectacular. There's one on my Angular After Dark show here on YouTube. There's one with the BLS show, I think. And I presented Spectacular for the first time in a tech talk with Santosh called Angular Testing. But that was more of like the background for it. And it was like 2.5 hours of how to unit test Angular. So that was a nice episode, and where I also presented Spectacular for the first time. And the previous video has been quite useful to get the idea. Okay, so that's the one on Angular After Dark. I hope so. But here we'll see from the scratch how to add it to a workspace with installing the libraries and everything. Probably did that in the other video as well. Okay, so from the router module, we're going to need the routes type here. We're going to have some routes. That is the type of routes. It's an array. We have some routes here. The first one will be path empty component. And then we are going to import the forecast component, or rather the forecast container component here, like so. And when we want to introduce a shell module, there would be the first level component here would be the shell component, and it would have children and a router outlet itself with children for each route or each part of this feature. Right now we just have one component, so let's just keep it simple for now. So this is our only route. It needs a path, it needs a component. That's it. There's nowhere else to go inside of this feature right now. So we need now the router module for child routes, and that's it. Okay, so we're not going to need to export this SCAM anymore, because people should not be using the component directly. They should rather be using the route. They should be routing to this this feature module using some path. So, but we need to import this SCAM so that the component is declared, because then it can be routed. But we're not going to need to export it anymore, since it's now intended to be a routed component. And now the app is breaking because it is trying to use this container component inside of its template. So I think these are the changes we're going to need. And yes, it was the After Dark installation and setup. The Angular After Dark for Spectacular, or what, Matteo? Okay, I think this is the change we're going to need inside of our feature module and in the container component. And now we're going to go back to the app component here, and instead of our CO2 forecast container component, we're going to add a router outlet now. Router outlet. And to use that, of course, it's complaining here. It doesn't know where to get this element from, or which component to map it to. That's because we need to add it in our SCAM. We're going to need the router module to get that router outlet directive. Yeah, I think it's actually a directive. So now it should be, hopefully it's happy up here. Well, maybe not. The Angular language server has been playing tricks on me in version 12. maybe some dependencies are out of date or out of sync, or I don't know. But yeah, now it's working after restarting the language server. Yes, good. So one last thing here. Now that we have the router outlet and the feature module has the router module for child routes, we're going to need the root routes. And there's also some nice patterns on how to do this. But yeah, that's more of an advanced use case. We don't need that right now. But here in this case, we could also use a shell module. There's 3 kinds of shell modules and shell libraries. But we're not going to import the router module. Hey, what did I say here? The router outlet? That's wrong. It should be the router module. The router outlet is the directive. Okay, so we're not going to import the router module for root here because that will add some providers. This is a SCAM, a single component Angular module. So it's only intended for setting up, configuring declarable dependencies. So that's the components, the directives, and the Angular pipes. So there shouldn't be anything like a service module adding providers. There should be no providers either. So instead, let's go into our app module here, which is not a SCAM, but it imports the app SCAM. And this is where we can do like root level configuration. There's another older pattern called, we could have a root module also for the core or the root level dependencies, but we don't really need that right now. Our app is not that big, and we're also going to be using the shell modules instead. Besides, we already split the app module into the app module, importing the browser module, and then the SCAM here. And the app module is then bootstrapping the app component, but everything about what's going on in the template of the app component is managed by the app SCAM, which is also a module, but a single component module. Okay, so here we can now import the router module for root. And then we're going to need the routes type again. Going to initialize the routes here. And now we need a path. The path will be, let's say, CO2. And now we need to pass it a module. So we'll say load children. And we will say, let's see, import. And we can use the path map name here, feature forecast. Then we have an ES module here, and it exports this feature module. That's what we need to return from the promise, the module to import. Okay, what did I do something wrong? Or maybe it's need to put it in a function. Yeah, that was probably it. Okay, so this sets a code splitting boundary for Angular so that this chunk, yeah, this is the dynamic import statement, or it looks like it. Webpack is actually turning it into a promise behind the scenes. So not really, at runtime at least. And it has some limitations. For example, Angular puts its own limitation. Like this has to be a syntax like so. I can't, for example, unwrap the module by using destructuring and then returning it like so. Angular compiler will complain and yell at me because it knows best, and I have to do it the Angular way. So yeah, it's not really dynamic import. It just looks like it. At least it's not the native dynamic import. It's being chunked up and served through a promise, loaded by Webpack, all of that goodness. but it's fake. It's Webpack, Angular, compiler, fake, not the web platform. So this is now our lazy loaded chunk. This is our feature. So every time the user goes to any route that begins with CO2, it will load this module, which will load the modules, the feature modules routes, which will allow us to see that CO2 forecast container component. Now we need to pass it to the for route here, and this will register these top level routes as well as providing, for example, an instance of the router service and its maybe some related dependencies. Actually, a lot of related dependencies. Yeah, that's why we use the for route here, because it comes with providers. You can see it returns a module with providers, and there's a bunch of them. And in the other module, we were using the for child. This is also a module with providers, but the only provider that it adds is these routes, this array of routes. All the services are only being provided here when we're using the for route static method, which is kind of a conventional name and pattern in Angular. Yeah, so that should be it. Let's see. Well, now the path is CO2, so either we need to make it empty, the default route, or we can do a redirect here. Let's start up here, say path empty, and then we need to say path match full, because by default the path match is actually prefix. So a prefix of empty, then it will match every route, because everything starts with the empty string. So that's why we need to say full, because it's only if it's exactly the empty string that's the route, not if it's empty string CO2. So yeah, it allows it to skip by if someone actually asked for the CO2 route or any other route. And final option here is the redirect to, and then we say CO2. So when we're opening up the app and just saying localhost 4200 or whatever in production the URL is, it will navigate us over to the CO2 route instead, which will then load this feature module and all of its routes. Good. Now we have all the Angular basics in place. Let's make sure here that it works. And hopefully it does. No? Something's wrong. Router module does not have mod property. That doesn't sound good. Give the Angular compiler a good kick, and it might work again. In the meantime, you're trying to render your component, importing the spectacular feature testing module with feature inside the render options, but a strong illegal state could not load the summary for the directive. Don't know what that is. Let me send you a link here in the chat for this example test, spectacular and Angular testing library spec in an example repo, and you might look into that for like a basic example. I guess this was from the BLS show. And make sure it's looking similar. But yeah, it is using, you need to import spectacular feature testing module with feature, and then pass it a feature module, which should be a routed feature module, including routes. And then the feature path, which should be the same path as in the application. In our case, it's CO2 here. No, it doesn't export all the components. The important thing is it needs to have routes. That's the important thing. And then you need to render the spectacular app component. We'll get to that as soon as we figure all of this out. All right. Nothing to complain about in the compiler. Is the app now working? Yeah, it is. Okay, so it was just the old Angular compiler with the hiccup. Again, getting old, Angular 12. Okay, so it's working now. But strange, it should have redirected to /CO2. It shouldn't really work. So what's going on here? That is strange. I have no idea. What is if I do say CO2, then it also shows CO2. So why is it not redirecting to? It doesn't say CO2 up here. You probably can't see it, but it just says localhost 4200. What did I do wrong here? Maybe I should say / redirect to. Or did I not? Is there something I didn't save here? Maybe that was my bad. Come on. Okay. Something broken in Angular, or am I not like? Did something change? Did redirect? Okay. If you figure out what I did wrong, please let me know. There's one more thing here, and that is this CO2. You can see we already have it duplicated 2 places here, and that's what ends up happening in Angular apps. You're going to have magic strings for routes all over the place for route path fragments or segments, as it's called. So let's actually put this in the library as an export. So this will be the CO2. Well, right now this is just one feature of the CO2. If we have the shell module, the shell library, that's where I would put this. Right now we just have one feature though. So CO2 route path TS. C#? No, not today. Export constant. It's going to be called CO2 route path. It's going to have this string. And then we need to export it in our public API here, which is the index.ts. So this is everything that's available outside of this library that we can import when we refer to well, if we import from here. So yeah, that's actually what we need right now. And I'm bad at hitting keys right now. Here it is. Now we should see we have the CO2 route path. So we can put that in here, and now there's just a single place to change it if it has to change. And this is the first part of not having magic route path strings sprinkled all over your app, especially also in the templates. You should really do something about that. For now, just for the route configuration. And maybe it helps if I put it down here. I don't know. Like, what is going on? Maybe booting up the Angular compiler again. And restarting the app and just going to the main route. And it hasn't finished compilation yet, I guess. No, Angular is really slow in version 12 because this machine is pretty fast. Okay, so now it's working, but it's not. It should be redirecting me to CO2, but it doesn't for some reason. But CO2 route also works. Now I'm saying /CO2, and I end up the same place. It's just strange that the root route, when I just say localhost 4200, it isn't redirecting me. That's kind of throwing me off here. Anyways, now the app is ready. We have refactor, turn CO2 forecast feature into a routed feature module, into router feature module. So which means that it's lazy loaded in this case. And I'm just going to shut down the development server. I'm going to run my format tool. Have a VS Code extension that sometimes mangles these import statements, which Prettier isn't always too happy about. Good, so that's a commit right there. Now we're set up for success. You have seen complaints about speed in Discord. Yeah, I think it's Angular 12, or it might be NX 12, but it's as soon as I'm compiling Angular, and I'm pretty sure it's using the Angular builders, so it would be strange if it was NX. Let's find here, or I'm used to NX console, and go to the app project, look for the build. I can click here to get to it inside my workspace configuration. And the executor is the Angular Dev Kit build Angular browser builder, or executor, or whatever it's called in NX terminology. So seems like it is the Angular 12 package that's really slow at compiling for some reason, at least on my machine. So yeah, that's unfortunate. Let me just have a sip of water, then we'll get into the testing starting from scratch. All right. Now we're not going to start up the app. Well, no, let's do it without it, because actually when we're testing using Spectacular and Angular testing module, we'll be able to test a feature module without an application. So basically you're creating a micro front end of sorts that can be put into any application, any Angular application, host application. You don't even need the app project. It's kind of exciting, as long as you know your way around Angular testing and TypeScript and Angular projects and all of that. Okay, Jordan, you're also saying NX is slow. React froze your machine when first running. Okay. Oh, that's unfortunate. I think I saw someone today also saying NX 12 is really slow. So I don't know what's going on there. Because NX 12 has been out for some time, came out before Angular 12. So that's kind of interesting. One thing I do know is that they happen to not test NX on, or the performance on Windows machines, and I'm using Windows here. Oh, seems like we actually, Wallaby is telling me here there's one test broken, and that's because we added a test to this feature module, and now we can see that test is actually working as expected, because it's saying, see, the error message is that it cannot render this energy CO2 forecast component inside of our testing host component, because our module is no longer exporting that component. So now we need to route instead. So we need to change here our feature module test. Let's do it more of a traditional way, rather than, I mean, here we could also use Spectacular, and we've kind of demonstrate the same thing and then some. But let's go with a traditional setup here. Sorry, it's taking a little while to get to the Spectacular part, but the app was not really a best practice app right now. So now we have imported the router module, so we should have access to the router outlet. The Angular language service is still playing tricks on me, so it probably needs another restart. And we are still in our test here. We're still importing this feature module. We actually need router testing module. import it, please. Okay, so it's not aware of that package yet, it seems. Here it is. So this one is stubbing out some browser dependency, which allows it to run in Karma especially. But there's also something in there for React, because React is not it's running on Node.js, so it doesn't have a browser. So it's also stubbing out some browser dependencies there. Okay, what's the routes? Well, actually, the routes are inside of CO2, right? Or this feature module. But yeah, actually, this is like in the traditional way. We would do something like this. So we would again say, here's where we can use the CO2 route path for the path, and we could do load. Wait, I need an array here. So children, and here we don't have to do the dynamic import. We can do it like so, and this will work just like lazy loading a module. But yeah, this works the same inside of a test. Now we're reusing this route path in our test, so that it works exactly the same as in the app. Well, yeah, you know what? This is going to be, yeah, there's more to this test. And this is exactly what Spectacular is hiding away. So I really don't want to write all of this. This was the only test case of this spec. So I'm actually going to delete that. And we're instead going to replace it with an integration test suite instead, because that's where Spectacular shines. There's a lot of configuration and setup needed to actually test a router feature modules. That's where Spectacular comes in and helps us. So yeah, let's focus on that instead. Maybe they changed the config in V12 and disabled the incremental compilation. Well, NX 12 was supposed to come with better performance, but again, that might not be the case on Windows. They have not been known to performance test on Windows. They use Mac and Linux themselves, the developers, and CI and so on. But yeah, other than that, incremental builds, incremental serves, I have had very little success with that on Windows. It has not been faster on large workspaces. Quite the opposite, in fact. So that has not been a success for me. Again, because they didn't performance test it on Windows. Might work well on Linux, on Mac. I can't really say. But on Windows, it sucks. Good. So we're adding this to previous, or no? Well, we can do it in this commit, so that it's kind of this commit replaces one test suite with another test suite. No, removing this. Remove outdated test suite feature module test suite. Because we kind of need a blank Git state now, because now we need to install the libraries we're going to need for this test. And you also saw that in Linux that there's good speed for NX. Yeah, might be another. Sorry, Windows users from NX. Starting to see a pattern here. Okay. What are we going to need? Well, we're definitely going to need Spectacular. So I'm using pnpm here. So that would be add save dev ngworker Spectacular. And it's not Spectator. That's another Angular testing library. Also a good one. But this one is specifically an Angular integration testing library. So it has a certain set of certain certain set of very focused testing APIs for specific things that are hard to test in Angular. Oh, so we also got a new version of NX Cloud, apparently. That's interesting. Okay, so that was Spectacular. We're also going to need the Angular testing library, which is add testing library /Angular. Now I'm thinking, I wonder if there's an ng add for that. But first of all, I mean, we could try it. But when using NX, you can't run just ng add or nx add. You have to first install the library. And then if there is an ng add schematic or generator, as it's called in NX, we have to run that manually afterwards. So that would be nx generate add testing library /Angular, and then the name of the generator or schematic, which would be ng-add. That's how ng-add works behind the scenes. So we can do the same thing here. Okay. There's no generators, it seems, or it doesn't support NX. Let's have a quick look here, just to make sure. Add testing library, Angular. Doesn't have a collections JSON. Nothing here about schematics or a collection. No, there's no ng-add schematic for Angular testing library. So now we have these two libraries. Do we need anything else? Yes, there's a nice little utility or add-on plugin for testing library, which is called testing library /user event. We're also going to add that. And that's what we're going to need. So yeah, let me show you here. So these three, ng worker Spectacular, testing library Angular, testing library user event. That's what we're going to need. All testing libraries. Good. And now we're ready to start setting up the first integration test suite. And we're starting here with the forecast feature. So we're going to, like here we see that the spec files are next to the class or whatever they are testing. So same thing, that's kind of the Angular convention. And we're doing the same thing here. So we're going to say CO2 forecast, and then we could say spec.ts, but I'll actually call it, and this is, you can call it whatever. I'll call it .integration.spec, and I might be able to filter out or in the integration test suites when I'm doing a test run, because they will be slower than the isolated unit test, because they will be testing a lot more code. So they'll be slower to run, slower to start up. However, not as slow as end-to-end tests, and that's kind of one of the benefits here of Angular testing library and Spectacular. They're using the testbed, and the testbed is quite fast, at least compared to end-to-end testing frameworks or most of them. So that's the idea behind Spectacular. The concept from end-to-end testing frameworks, the concept of testing as a user. That's also the kind of concept of Angular testing library. So test as a user, but then also having the balance of the speed and the flexibility of the test bed, which is optimized for Angular. So it's trying to get the best of both worlds without too many trade-offs. So yeah, let's see. So CO2 forecast integration spec. You don't have to put in this .integration. The important thing is still .spec.ts, because that's what our tooling is set up to pick up on. But I'll call it .integration.spec.ts, because then I can run only the integration tests with some work. I mean, I have to set up the tool chain for this, but yeah. Let me have some water and we'll start writing this. Goodness. Okay. What are we going to test? We're going to test the CO2 forecast integration test, or forecast. I mean, you could say feature, but just CO2 forecast. That is the feature. And I'm still running here. Can't see for the camera. There it is. Wallaby JS, which is a paid tool, a VS Code extension, but there's also an extension for other editors like WebStorm and Atom. So it's a paid product. I'm not paid to advertise, but I just love it. I've been using it for years. And you can see here I'm getting inline feedback in my tests that the test is actually failing because it doesn't have any tests or test cases. So here I would need to add a test case, so an it function call with a callback. And now they are green here. I can see in the gutter. This is Wallaby telling me that now the tests are running and passing. And the same down here, the whole workspace has 19 tests. They're all passing. Okay, now we're going to start with the setup. Okay, let's see here. Matteo is saying that I have told you, Matteo, that the feature module is cached by the compiler, but then it won't be as fast as Spectator. Yeah, Angular has been optimizing the speed of the testbed ever since, or starting with Angular 9, Ivy. Ivy allowed for some optimizations. The testbed had been really, really slow, especially because it was, for every test case, it would have to read all the files with the components, the templates, the style sheets, and then recompile the whole thing. But then they started to add a caching layer so that the compiled output would be cached, and they have been optimizing on that ever since Angular 9 was released in February 2020. So today it's actually pretty fast, and we'll actually see that in Wallaby. Will be showing us the test execution speed as we go. But keep in mind that this is an integration test, so it's going to be slower, but it's certainly not going to be slow. Like, it's going to be fast enough that it's enjoyable to work with. Or maybe, so I don't know about Spectator here, or if you're actually asking about Spectacular. Spectator is the other Angular testing library, which is also great, but focusing on other things. So I'm not sure what the question is here. Okay, you're saying follow up. Sorry. Oh, hey, Serkan. Hello. Faster than end-to-end, but still testing a lot more code than unit tests. Yes, it is. Spectacular is trying to sit somewhere between the void between isolated unit tests and end-to-end tests, where you load the whole app in the compiled bundle and so on, and in a real browser. So Spectacular sits here between the two. It's integration tests, so it's loading multiple classes, first of all, not just one component. It's also trying to not fake too many classes. Instead, it'll say something like, every time we're interacting with the server, of course, we'll fake that somehow. And then the question is how close to like the implementation. Do we want to replace the Angular's HTTP client, our own HTTP client, or do we want to send in an actual request but intercept it, for example, using mock service worker? Because you would be able to do something similar in an end-to-end testing framework So yeah, Spectacular, since it's using the testbed, will be faster than end-to-end tests. Not because of Spectacular, but because of the Angular testbed. And you will be comparing the execution times. Nice. I'd love to see those numbers. And you're welcome, Matteo. Yeah. So yeah, right now, Spectacular, I'm sorry to say, doesn't have very good documentation. It only has this, it's not very good on the NPM page. It only has this API reference where every part of the public APIs are mentioned by name and like what is it, what type is it, and a little description. All of this will be available in the inline JS docs as well. So when you import something, you can read the same descriptions. But it doesn't really have like a full example in the documentation, simply because I haven't figured out how to add a docs website yet. It's certainly something on my roadmap. The most important things actually right now on the roadmap is verifying compatibility with multiple versions of Angular. That would actually, when I've done that, I would be happy to put it at 1.0. It's very stable today. I'm just not sure which versions of Angular it supports, so I don't want to make that promise yet, although I think it will support many versions of Angular. And the other thing is documentation, because the previously most important thing was figuring out how it can work with Angular testing library, because that's the best library for test as a user, but without end-to-end tests. So yeah, I figured out how to do it, and I didn't have to change the library because I had already implemented it in a way where I thought I would be able to integrate it with the Angular testing library, and that was a huge success. So the next step, of course, is then documenting how to do it. I've been doing some example repos and videos like this one. Next thing is setting up a docs website for this and adding some full examples, because your only help right now is going in and finding the example test suites. Like here, we can see the 3 APIs of Spectacular. The feature testing one is the one we're using today. So it has this integration spec for the crisis center from the Two of Heroes routing tutorial. So we're using that as a feature module or feature library, and testing it without an application, but using Spectacular. And here in this test, I have created my own testing utilities, which are wrapping the test bed. But I really don't want to, I didn't want to make something like this part of the library, because that's exactly what Angular testing library is doing very well already. So I would rather integrate with that library than having to reinvent the wheel in Spectacular. So Spectacular is more focusing on the configuration of the router testing module and the Angular testing module, and then adding some convenience service replacements on top of that, or service extensions specifically for the router and the location service from Angular. But anyways, here you can see how to use it just with the test bed. Created some helper APIs here, wrapping the test bed, but really should be looking into here. I have the branch called Spectacular, something with testing library, Angular testing library. Then you can go here, find the folder Angular testing library, and see where I wrote, I think, most of that same test suite, but using the testing library. So here you'll have a really good example. Let me put it in also put that in the chat, because that's a much bigger example than the other one I sent you. Here, this is a really complicated test suite actually. It's the Angular routing tutorial, so it will have almost a lot of different features from the Angular router. Well, I see that I didn't implement the whole test suite, but enough to have confidence that how it works. So this is what I need to describe. and this is what we're going to be doing right now. But here's a more full example, right? I'll put it in the chat now. But it's in the repo, ngWorker monorepo, and then this feature branch spectacular Angular testing library. But this was to figure out whether I needed to change spectacular. That wasn't the case. So that was very nice. Back to the tests. Yeah, it's working. Good. Now we need to, maybe I should take that file myself, right? Or that URL. Here. Yes. So we're going to need some setup. So we're going to have our before each. And then we're going to be learning some Angular testing library APIs. But here, most importantly, how to use Spectacular for the setting up the Angular testing module, the test bed. So we're going to have a shared variable, going to call it result, because of the type that it's going to hold here is something from the testing library / Angular called render result. Render result, and then whatever component it's testing. And in our case, it will be the spectacular. Now we need to import from spectacular at ngWorker spectacular. And then the spectacular, you can see here there's a bunch of public things inside spectacular. But the one we need right now is the spectacular app component. That is a root component for testing purposes. So that will be similar to a component fixture from testbed. Yeah, that will be the root component of the test. So to get that result, we're going to need here from the Angular testing library, the render function. This is the most important one. We're going to say result equals render, and then you need to pass it a component and then some options. So the options will be here. And here we need the component, and this is where we're actually taking this spectacular app component and making that the subject under test, or the component under test as far as Angular testing library is concerned. But really, it's very similar to an app component. Well, it actually only holds a router outlet in its template. That's almost everything it does. So it's just a convenience component so that you don't have to create one yourself for this. But in this case, usually when you use Angular testing library, it's the component here that's the important one. But here, that's the unimportant one. That's just a testing host component or a testing root component, actually. And the important thing is down here in the options. So now we're going to, because this will be set up with a scam declaring it. And when you're using a scam, a single component Angular module with Angular testing module, you need to pass this option, exclude component declaration, because by default, when you pass in a component to render, it will be added to a declarations array of the Angular testing module by Angular testing library, because that, just for convenience. But when you're using scams, you already have a component declaring that component, or sorry, you already have a module declaring that component. So you don't need also Angular testing library to declare it for you. So instead, you would be importing it here. So say we had a spectacular app scam, and we actually do, as you can see here, but that is, it's also imported by the one we're really going to need here, which is the spectacular, I can't even spell it right now, spectacular feature testing. Oh, go away, tooltip. Spectacular feature testing module dot with feature, and then some options. So this will behind the scenes also import the SCAM for this Spectacular app component. That's why we need this exclude component declaration option, as you do with every other SCAM when you're testing. So with feature, and here we need to add two options for Spectacular. One is the feature module. So that's the routed feature module, which is the scope of this test. And in our case, it was the CO2 forecast feature. No, what was it called? Let's find the name here. It should be right next to it. Here, this one. Let's see if auto import works. It doesn't, so that's why I couldn't find it. So import from relative path. Here it is. Okay, so that's the scope for our test, this feature module. And that's all we need to tell Spectacular and Angular testing module to import everything that's behind the boundary of this routed feature module. So all the routes, all the components, all the services used, they will all be included. So yeah, that's really nice. That's what I was going for, that you're basically saying much more than this is the module I want to test, and you take care of all the routes and all that. We need one more thing, and this is we need the same feature path as root, or the same feature route path as is used in the application. So this is where we are going to need this constant that we created. Again, the CO2 route path. Here it is. We're going to use the same thing here. The reason for that is that these route paths are usually sprinkled all over component templates, especially. So it will say CO2/this, CO2/that inside of router link directives and so on. So we really need to make sure it's the same here in the test as in the real app, or otherwise those links will not work when you click them. Okay. Oh, okay. So yeah, render is async. So I need to await it, and then I need to make the function async. There we go. So this is everything you need to pass to Spectacular's feature testing API, to at least when working with the Angular testing library. So these two things are the important bits here, and then also this option. Basically everything you see here, that is the important setup for Spectacular when working with the Angular testing library. Mateos, starting to remember the library for documentation, Docusaurus. Yes, that's also the one I'm going to be looking at. And there's an NX plugin for that, and Spectacular isn't in an NX workspace. So yeah, I've also been working on other things for these past months. So yeah, that's on my very near the top on my to-do list right now is adding documentation for Spectacular, and hopefully someone can add documentation for Lumberjack as well. Yeah. Okay, so this is the important things about setting up a test suite and an integration test suite using both Spectacular and this is the Angular testing library right here. There's another option for Spectacular. It can also work with Angular component harnesses. Maybe we'll get into that some other time. Or the third option, like I did in the test suite for Spectacular itself, you can also use just testbed, but it's a bit more verbose, which is why we have all these Angular testing libraries in the first place. Mock providers, features, stores, effects added to the render. Yes. Here we can add providers. We can add modules with providers, everything you need. So for example, here say provide say a hero service. You could say use class and then fake hero service, or maybe it was stop service or something like that, or maybe you're using NV2 mocks or auto providers, AutoSpy, what they're all called. But since this is an integration testing library, we want to write integration tests. So we really want to replace as little as possible when doing integration tests. So there should really be very little need to add mock providers and features. But you have the option to do so. It's just maybe not the best approach. Well, depending, of course, on your setup, but well, yeah, okay. So maybe your feature module has some feature state or feature stores from NGRX. Yeah, then you would need a router, or sorry, a root store. But for that, I actually use the real root store sometimes in tests. Because why would you need a fake one? It will be put in the context in the real app of a real root store. So you don't really need a fake one. That's for another time. We should mock HTTP request. Yes, that is definitely one place we do need to stub out the requests. As soon as there's an HTTP request, and we've been talking about these different options of doing that, we can replace the Angular HTTP client, we can use mock service worker, or we can replace our own HTTP client here. But then we wouldn't be testing that HTTP client, and it has somewhere here. It actually has a lot of logic, so it would be good to also test that as part of the integration test suite. So, but yeah, different options. You do have the option to replace everything here in imports and providers, but you should be thinking, let's not stop this out. We want to test as much of the real code as possible. And does this work with Wallaby, or is it a false positive? It's working. There's just not anything in the test right now. So yeah, it is working with Wallaby. Wallaby has 0 configuration for NX, Karma, Jasmine, Mocha. What do we have? Jest, Create React Vue CLI, Angular CLI. All of these just work by saying Wallaby start. Or if it shouldn't be looking at the root directory of your repo, you have to say select configuration and then choose a subdirectory. Maybe there was a directory inside of here called NX Workspace or something. But in most cases, do Wallaby start and you're good to go. It can take a little while to spin everything up because, but that's because it's keeping the tests hot in the background, which is why we get this really fast feedback. It's not restarting the whole test suite every time. So there's some magic going on. You do use the real store too, but mark the service responses. Yeah, yes. So HTTP responses, those are what we should be stubbing or mugging somehow. But yeah, then the question is which method to use. So yeah, that's good. That's the right thinking. Also, if there was a WebSocket, of course, we should replace that. Maybe if there was some local storage, we should also stub that out with test data. Any kind of I/O like that. Yeah, good. So now we have the setup here for how to configure Spectacular and Angular testing module for an integration test suite. So testing this whole feature module, the routed feature module. Remember, it has, right now it's just one route, but like the same goes for no matter how many routes are inside of this routed feature module. We will have access to all the routes. And then because of that, all the components that are kind of behind the boundary of this feature module. Yes. So yeah, that is it for now. Except yeah, we are going to need some mocked or stopped providers of some sorts. But let's see that when it happens. Well, okay. So first, yeah, let me already add the HTTP client testing module, because I don't want my computer to send requests to the API because it will be doing it a lot every time I restart this test. So just for the sake of not hitting the real API and bombarding them with requests. So now it will never receive a request or a response for an HTTP request when it uses the HTTP client from Angular until I tell it what it's going to receive. So yeah, that's good enough for now. Okay, one more thing that I usually use when using Angular testing with the testbed. This result object from Angular testing library, it has the component fixture in a property here called fixture, and then I set auto detect changes. Call that. Then I will have to do less of fixture.detect changes. But other than that, the Angular testing library is already doing this a lot for us. Every time we click a button, it will also be trying to detect changes. And when we use other interactions, it will also be running detect changes. So it will work most of the time. We're also going to pass it through because then that will be the ng on init, the initial change detection cycle. So I use this with the testbed. If it was the testbed here, I would have a component fixture. Then I will call detect, auto, would have the same auto detect changes true. So when using Angular testing library, it's hidden behind this property. The result object, then fixture. One more thing to point out here, the more of the convention for Angular testing library and the other testing libraries, I think, is doing a destructuring like so. Rather than putting in a variable called result, you can say, oh, I need the fixture, I need the screen, maybe. No, that's not in here. We have of goodness. Yeah, all these queries, helper functions, debug elements. Yeah, but I am, let's see. Yeah, I'm putting it in here because then I'm sharing this setup. I'm storing it because I'm sharing this setup between all my test cases. So this is just my way of doing it. You can still do it this way if you want to. The most important one here is the navigate function, especially for integration testing. So I'm doing it this way. I'm storing this result object from Angular testing library. And this will be available between all the test cases rather than having to pass all of this in every test and then destructuring. Good. So now we're ready for our first test. Okay, Jordan, how is it working with zoneless? The Angular test bed is in a zone, so you can't really do zoneless there. For zoneless, I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but I have been reading the code where it seems like it's always inside of the zone. I'm not sure there is a way to disable the zone for a test bed. Maybe there is an injection token, but I don't think so. So what you would need to do is use an end-to-end test, basically. Or maybe, I don't know, Cypress has this component test API, and there's stable ones for React and Vue. The Angular one is the Angular component test for Cypress is still in beta, I think, and has been so for quite a while, years. I think. So might not be fully working yet. Maybe that works. I don't know. Otherwise, you're going to have to use end-to-end testing frameworks for zoneless. Or maybe not. I'm not 100% sure, because maybe when you're detaching from the zone, at least when using something like RX Angular templates, some of those, then you're probably also detaching from the testbed zone. In that case, you're like, are you going to have a hard time? No, because something like RX Angular template would be calling detect changes whenever there is an update in the DOM. So it's more of a question, can you disable the ng zone in testbed? I haven't figured out why. I am pretty sure, pretty convinced that it's always running with the ng zone, the testbed. But let me know if you find out otherwise. Okay, the first test case. We have all this good setup done, and this will be basically the boilerplate for integration tests. Then the things that are going to be different is, well, of course, which module and which path for the route, which lazy loading path, but especially like the providers. If there is anything, providers being stepped out, that will be things that can vary between integration tests. Yeah, well, let me know if you try something with zoneless. I'd be very interesting to know. Okay. First thing, displays a title or a heading. That's a simple thing, right? How could we do that? We would start by saying result.navigate, and then we would actually say, well, we could use this again, the CO2 route path. So now we have navigated in our test app to that route, and that route has then activated this route here, which activates the CO2 forecast container component. So what should we expect as a user? What should we expect to see now? Let's have a look in the component here. Well, this is a container component, so its template will only have the presentational component and some data bindings. And sorry, I'm using async. I should be using RX Angular template instead. That's a lot nicer. But async will also do the job in some cases. It's just not very ergonomic and doesn't take everything into account. So let's go on to the presentational component instead. Oh, I can't go to definition. Maybe that doesn't work for inline templates yet. That's too bad. So I have to find the where is it? Forecast. Oh, here it is. CO2 forecast.sfc. That's for single file component. I am doing something unconventional here. I have the component in one file. I have the styles here too. I have the templates here too. The component model, even the freaking scam engine module here is also in the same file. And look at that, it's still a reasonable amount of lines of code. So what do we expect? We expect to see a heading, an H1 here with the title CO2 forecast. You're missing navigation initialization. Yeah, that like, okay, so yeah, I'm trying to remember. There is a feature, navigation initializer in Spectacular, but I think I left it out when you're using Spectacular in this way for the Angular testing library purposes, because you really want to use the navigate function from Angular testing library, because it has some patching behind the scenes and replacing some things. But you could still use, let's see here, feature router. There's a service called Spectacular Feature Router. Could still use that from here. Testbed, inject, or we could do result fixture or debug element. What's debug? What is that? Is it a function? Oh, I don't know. So the debug element, we could do the injector get. So that would be the Angular testing library way of doing it, but we can also call the testbed directly here. That would give us the same. So here, feature router, and using either one of these two techniques here. Let's go with the Angular testing library one. Not read property injector. Really? Of null? So the debug element is null? That's not nice. Okay, let's use the testbed inject instead. Okay, so we, rather than result navigate from the Angular testing library, we could also use the feature router. What the feature router does from Spectacular is it has navigate and navigate by URL, but it allows this special symbol here, the tilde character, which means feature relative. So when I say tilde or tilde slash, or both of them, it will navigate to the default route of this feature module. So that I don't have to say CO2 route path, or if there's a nested route, I don't have to say like, I can say like this instead of like this, so that I don't have to keep mentioning this CO2 and the CO2 route path everywhere. So that's just a convenience service by Spectacular. That will also work. We could even take the Angular router that inject the router. Give me the router. You could also use that. That would also still work. What happened now? Oh, still good. Navigate by navigate. No, Angular router. Navigate by URL. CO2 details. If there was a details route, right? So we could also use any of these will work, but when you call the one from Angular testing library, yeah, we're just making sure that we're like it's aware of that navigation. So if there's something special it needs to set up or replace, it will be able to do that, because it wouldn't if we would use these other APIs. But yeah, based on my experience, they still work. You can use them instead of this one, but let's stick to the convention here, which is the navigate function. But yeah, they will all work. Yeah, so router, like routing initialization, that will work if you're using, it will navigate to the default route, if the default feature route, if you're using Spectacular with the testbed, so not with Angular testing library. Why? I don't want to have a dependency on Angular testing library in Spectacular. So because of that, I'm unable to call this navigate function myself inside of Spectacular. So you're going to have to do this yourself. So maybe we could do it as part of the testing setup if we wanted to. Could do it like so. This is async probably. Yeah. So we would have to wait that. Now we're starting on the default route in every test case, but when we start to have more routes, we'll have to navigate away anyways, so it won't help us too much. But when you're using Spectacular with the testbed, it will do this for you, basically. Do you need to wait for when stable? No, I don't think so. This is one of the things that Angular Testing Library is taking care of when you're using testing library. And when you're using Spectacular with the testbed, in that case, you're using the create feature harness from Spectacular. It looks like so. And then the same options here. Basically the same options. Yeah. When you're using it this way, it is doing that initial navigation. It is also waiting for like when the app is stable. So after navigation has occurred and all of that, that is part of Spectacular when you're using the Spectacular feature harness. But now you don't have the ways of interacting with the DOM that we're going to be using now from the testing library. So you'd have to do all of that manually using the testbed API, which is kind of a inconvenient. So yeah, the harness can also accept some providers, also accept some imports. So similar to Angular Testing Library and most other libraries, the harness object has inject, which is exactly the same as calling testbed.inject. So it's just for convenience purposes. And it has the location, the feature location service, which has path. So it will return a feature relative path. For example, it would say details, like so. And it has the one we just saw here, which is the feature router, which has the navigate and navigate by URL. Here we could say details to navigate to the, this would be the same as in our case saying CO2 details. Is there anything else in here? Yeah, there's also the root component instance and the root component fixture, just in case you want to, and you're going to need that for the Angular component harnesses, but that's for another time. Now we're using the Angular testing library because that allows us to the next thing we need to do here is inspecting the DOM. So get rid of all of this mess. Let me enable this hero, which sorts all these imports and gets rid of unused ones. But it's not always agreeing with prettier. That's where I go wrong. If your component is calling store on init, yeah, good luck with that. Testing the store is not nice. Yeah, but I tend to actually use the real store and not the mock stores for my testing. But yeah, you need a lot of experience to figure out when to do what. But I'm basically an NGRX noob, so maybe I'm just too inexperienced. But I don't use fakes unless I need to. And I don't inject the store directly in a component. So I don't have to replace the store for unit testing a component. Okay. Also, I switched to NGX component store, so that's a lot easier. So we want to test or verify that it displays a heading. So now we need, let's see, the screen. And we can get that here from the testing library for Angular. Screen. Based on what I've read, it's better to use the screen here, which has all of these queries and so on. It's better to use the screen global rather than, even though they're also available here, result, and then all these query thingies. I read a best practices blog post by Ken C. Dodds, and he's the creator and maintainer of testing library. So I'm counting on him to know best. So use screen instead. What do we need now? Okay, so Angular or the testing library has a lot of query functionality here. Which one to use? Let's go look at what's called the cheat sheet. So we'll be going, there's nothing specific to Angular testing library about the queries and stuff, except that we should import it from testing library Angular, the screen object, rather than from testing library DOM, which we don't have installed. But it uses the same API. So we can go to DOM testing library, which is the core library. We can go to the cheat sheet here, which I always do. And here we can see in this matrix which of the querying APIs we need. So we want to look for one element, this one. And, oh, no. Okay, so it's more like if there's no match, so if it doesn't find the element, what should happen? Should it throw? Should it return a null value? Well, all by is looking for multiple elements. I'm only looking for one, so it should be one of those three here. But do I want it to throw or return a null value? I want it to throw if it doesn't find a title. Okay, so it's one of these two, get by or find by. And what's the difference? Okay, so one is async, and this one is async, find by, and the other one is synchronous. So let's see. Is my test case async? Not right now. So right now, let's go for the synchronous one, this one, get by. And get by is just a prefix of the name. There's a lot of get bys here. There's get by label text, get by placeholder text, get by text, get by display name, a lot of different things. And in common is it's kind of this testing as a user approach. So it has accessibility in mind, if you're familiar with HTML and website accessibility. So it would be get by, and then it would probably be the role. And here, the text, right? The text. So what would be the text? CO2 forecast. And then some options where we can specify role. No, I guess the role is, sorry, I have this backwards. The role is it's either header or heading. I'm trying to remember. This is the area role or the HTML accessibility role. Header or heading? Okay, so here it's saying, let's open up Wallaby, saying testing library unable to find an accessible element with the role header. Okay, so it is probably heading. There's also a place to look up these role names, but I can't remember right now, but search for it and you'll find. I'm not sure it's in the DOM library documentation, but yeah, it's something about HTML, right? So you should be able to find it. Also, testing library will be helping you. So if you spell it wrong, it'll say, that doesn't work. There's also like, I don't remember how right now, but there are some helpers to, oh, that's probably the debug function that can help you figure out which roles are available right now in the view. But anyway, seems that it can find a heading. So I have to specify now the name. The name really means what's the text of this H1 element. So here, CO2 forecast. Okay. But it says it's not able to find that. Okay, did I spell it wrong? Or Oh, that's right. That is the right one. Okay, what if I don't have the name? Then it's happy. Okay. Okay, let's make sure that it can actually find it. So first I will do the not so accessible way, so not the best practice way when working with testing library. Find by text, and then just CO2 forecast. Is there any name with the text CO2 forecast? I think so. Let me just check by adding rubbish. Oh, get by text, so that it froze. Okay, now not an element with this text. What about the real text I'm looking for? Still no? Okay. So did I forget something is the question. Okay. This is certainly a question for the Discord server for testing library. There's a channel for Angular where you can the Angular testing library where you can ask Tim or someone else, but I'm sure Tim will answer when he can. There's not a lot of activity, so I'm sure he'll be able to tell you for sure whether you can specify a custom data test ID attribute, because the default one is data test ID. So let's say this H1 we had this ID heading, for example, or my header or something, right? That's the default one, and you're looking to customize it with label or something. And yeah, I don't know if Angular testing library is able to do this. Maybe. Let's make sure I have spelled it right here. Oh, it's with a lowercase f. So I'm just stupid. Yeah, okay, so at least there is an element. Now I'm using the more generic querying API, but I should be thinking accessible. The user is not interested in seeing any element with the text of CO2 forecast. They're interested in seeing a heading because then it's accessible to screen readers and people driving their car and using a screen reader or whatever. So yeah, now it was just me with a spelling mistake, right? So let's add some gibberish here, and it will fail again. Good. So it's failing. Now it's passing with what we actually expected. So that's our first test. After 2 hours, we have one integration test. There you go. Are you convinced? Yeah, it is actually getting late, but let's add one more. Let's at least add one more. Does it support area level? Well, it supports, okay, area level. Is that for headers? Let me look for that. Yeah, well, let's try. Let's try it out. I mean, that's the purpose of testing library, is taking accessibility into account. So I would expect it works that way, but let's find out for sure. Let's even delete it here. Yes, it's still working. It's still breaking as expected and then working as expected. So yes, it does work. Hello, Julian. Nice of you to come out of the lurking in the shadows. Okay, yeah. So okay, let's get the real heading back. But yes, it does take accessibility into mind, so it does support area attributes as well. So that's nice. Okay, so I know this is not very convincing, right? Just querying some element here. So let's try to get into something more, one more test case, and that will be more advanced, right? But the whole purpose of this is seeing how to set everything up, and then hopefully you can use your imagination to see like how can this be useful, or you can watch the other videos where I'm like with Tech Talks with Santosh or the BLS show, where I'm explaining more about Spectacular. But yeah, I think we'll only have time for one more because it's getting late here. It's probably late with you too, some of you at least. Yeah, I'm going to commit this because now we have our first working test, the integration test here. And did I change something? Probably just some formatting. Yeah, that's my extension here messing up or fighting Prettier. Let's run the format again, and it will probably go away. There we go. Okay, so test add. Oh, what did it install? Oh, probably some formatting again. Right. Go away. Okay. Add CO2 forecast integration test. Sweet, like so. First commit down. Okay, nice. So there is a way to configure, customize the testing ID attribute. Okay. Thinking back on the, like, what do we have here? Okay. First thing, I want to see a date time value representing the first 5 minutes of the current day. That's actually a pretty complicated use case. And the most complicated part is we're going to test all the code basically in this repo, at least everything, everything here in data access, everything domain, everything utilities, everything in feature forecast. All of this code is being tested in this one next test case. Of course, also in this one, but yeah, even in this one. But we could still pass that test by removing this table. So it's not really verifying that all that data loading behavior and rendering it to the table and all that. So this is probably where we're going to need that test ID. So we would say data test ID. I'm just keeping with the conventional name here, although I personally prefer this. So whatever. Date time cell. Oh, okay. So now, like, how does it act if there's multiple elements with the same test ID? Can you still query all of them with the same test ID? I hope so. Otherwise, a more conventional way or classical way of doing it is you can say, give it a class, call it QA datetime cell or test datetime cell. And yeah, we can query on the class instead. Let's see if it doesn't work like so. So we're going to query for the first date time cell element and verify that it what would it output? Let me just see here if I can find the actual app. No, I don't have that running anymore. So let's start it up. I'm sure I'll have time for some water because something is really slow in Angular 12. Boom. It's done. Okay. So now we should have the app running again. Let's open it up here. So we want to see basically this, but really this is what we're interested in. But also ideally, like the current day. I just don't want to go through the hassle of formatting a date value right now. So in the first test case here, we're just going to be looking for this string or this text. Just trying to keep it somewhat simple so that we can do this quickly and then wrap up. It displays the first 5-minute interval of the current Danish day. Expect the test, expected text until I come up with a better name. expect the time and so time and offset. Yeah. Okay. So we're okay. So now timing starts to play a role here, and also we have to provide it with some data, because it like right now it's trying to send an HTTP request, so we have to give it something back, or it won't render anything. In that case, the only thing we'll see is this CO2 forecast and maybe the header of the table here, but not these actual cells because there won't be any forecast. So this is our setup. We can do our AAA here just for can be explicit about the phases we have. I don't add the comments usually, but I'm trying to get you familiar with these terms, this terminology. And sometimes we have some extra special teardown here as well. Sometimes we even have like we should try to avoid that, but in some cases it makes sense to have act number 2, act or assert number 2, and so on. Usually just one of each, because you want each test case to be asserting only one thing most of the time, even for an integration test. Okay, let's figure out the query, because we can set that up already. It will be screen and then something maybe similar to before, right? Get by, it's definitely a get by, because that will look for the first, and if it doesn't find one, it will throw, then the test will fail. So get by test ID, yeah. And then what did we call it? I think it was date, time, cell. Make sure here that, oh, date test ID, that's not real, right. It should be the data test ID, my bad. Sorry, that would have caused me some trouble. Date times cell. Date times cell. Is there any options or something? Yeah. So things here. Oh, what else? What else? Yeah, this is where I'm kind of. What does it do when it finds multiple cells? Well, right now it's complaining that it doesn't find one at all. It's because none are rendered. How about if we put in, let's put in a row before any data is loaded, just to make sure that it can find this. Now it should be able to find one, and it does. Okay, good. Okay, so this would actually return the cell element here. There's no real options we need to. No, there's no options we need. So from here, we could say this was the cell we wanted. Yeah, let's even put in this just to see how what that would look like. Expect cell to, let's see if it just has some nice matchers for HTML elements. I don't know. Let's see. To contain expected time and offset. Oh, okay. Cell that text content. Yeah. So if this was the real cell that was loaded by the data, this is what our assertion needs to look like. To be, to contain, because it will be part of that whole text. Okay, so now let's get rid of these fixed row, and let's look for the actual data points when data becomes available. So now it's failing until we do things right here. And there is actually no act because that is implicit, because we did this thing, right? We navigated to the route that has this forecast feature. So we don't have an act here. But setup is where we need to do something. So we did already use the HTTP client testing module. So we could use that, the Angular HTTP testing API, which we already have been using for testing this HTTP client of our own. But the responses here are a bit like there's a lot of nesting going on, but yeah, the trade-off is if we instead replace our own HTTP client, this one, if we replace that in the test, we won't be testing this class, and we would really be wanting to test all of the code inside of this feature, or at least as much as possible, the real classes, the real functions, the real everything. So let's use the HTTP client testing module, even though it's very inconvenient. If I knew how to use mock service worker, I would probably use that, but I still need to learn that. So let's go with this one that I do know. Okay. So arrange, we still need some setup here. We're going to have an HTTP controller. That's that. Inject HTTP control testing controller. Maybe just call it controller because we don't have any Angular controllers anymore. So no, let's call it HTTP controller. So, well, I guess in the act, would that be the right place to make a response? No, it's in the setup. We're setting up the environment. So the environment will respond with expect one. Now the URL should be able to find that. Well, the URL, there's a long query string parameter called SQL with a long Postgres SQL query inside of it, believe it or not. You have seen this if you've watched some of the previous episodes. So let's instead do a matcher here. So if we have a request, the request URL starts with And then we should have the, oh, that might not be public. That might not be a public property anywhere. Where's the URL? Here it is. I don't think this is exposed inside of this library, so it's not something we have access to in the other library, and we shouldn't. I mean, need it for the test, but that's not a reason for exposing it. So it's not in here, and it shouldn't be. It's an implementation detail. But since now we're integration testing, we do need to take into consideration which API endpoints are being hit, because we need to create these fake responses. So the URL should start with this, and the method should be get. Didn't find any. Okay, so maybe let's just expect anyone. Let's expect any request. Does that work? No. Okay, so it's not being triggered. So I'm wondering if there's a provider missing somewhere, but I don't think so. The container component is probably providing something. Yeah, the store, right? And that's hopefully the only service we have here. Yeah, it is. So that's not the issue. So it could be timing, like some time has to pass before the request starts to fire. Oh, there's also the timing of when we need to set up the request in the HTTP controller. But I think it is, I mean, I'm going to look in this working test suite, but I think it is after the request have been sent, then we can call HTTP controller expect one to say, oh, you should have one request queued up that matches these conditions here. And in this case, we're saying should have any request. You should match any request right now. Let's see what it looks like in the test suite for this service, this HTTP client, because here we do have all of this set up properly. Oh, I did call it controller. How terrible of me. So yeah, I'll also do that here to be consistent. So we should have another assert down here. Protocol verify, which will verify that there are no outstanding HTTP requests we didn't take into account. Okay, so the timing here. Let's copy something in here because that was working. Except we don't, what's going on? Except we don't have this string here. So let's get that. This should be working because it is in the other test. And then we just need to flush a response, but it's already failing here. So some time needs to pass. And one way what are you seeing here, Matteo? Is there a way to print where I am in the test, like the current route? Yeah, the current route, that would be the location service from Angular. So you could inject the location service and then say .path, and you will get the current routed path, the active route path. You're not getting your element. there's also there's a debug function on this. I don't know if it's on the screen or the result or both, but if you call this debug, it will print out. Sure, it will print out. Let's see. Let me just activate only this test. Because this should print out to the console. Oh, we need to pass it an element. What about screen debug? Does that also need an element? Okay. So do we have a root element? This one is pretty printing the current HTML. That's also pretty nice. So let's see, what could we do? We could do result fixture, no, container. What's that? That's an element. So this should actually work. Maybe Wallaby is filtering something out. I need to put here. I'm not sure if Wallaby is filtering out some console logs here or something. This should be calling console log itself. Right? Yeah. It doesn't return anything. Okay, I can't remember. Something like that. It will out pretty print the DOM. Oh, here it is. Yeah, here it is. So it should also be showing out here. No. Well, okay, at least here it's showing up, right? So this is the DOM of the root component with everything that's currently active, right? So this is a good utility, screen.debug. Then pass it in the container component, the root component here. Empty router outlet. Yeah, so something's not quite working. Maybe a guard. Yeah, that's another thing. Like, you might want to replace your guards in the tests, depending on where are you then testing the guards. But yeah, if there's like a login guard, a route guard or something, disable that for the purpose of the test, except if you're specifically testing the login functionality. So that's where the flexibility of the test bed comes into place. That's another benefit that you don't really have in the same way with end-to-end testing frameworks. In that case, you need to have like a macro of some steps to log in before the test case or something like that. So yeah, that is what happened, a route guard. So you can replace that by using the providers, then provide and give it a name of that route guard, and then use class, and then a route guard that does nothing. I think so. Yeah. So yeah, just to show you, here, providers, here, this line. It would look something like this. Here you would have your route guard class, then you would give it a fake route guard that does nothing, or no op route guard. Of course, you would need to set that up like as a real route guard with the, well, a route guard just needs to implement a function, right? So it should just have that, or a method. So it should have that method, but doing nothing, right? I'm pretty sure that would work. Yeah. So provide your route guard name here, use class and then a fake one or a no-op route guard, and that hopefully that will work. But isn't it also interesting that you can test everything, including the route guards, in your integration test without the end-to-end test, right? Because what's the alternative? You can unit test a route guard. You might even integration test a route guard by passing some fake URLs and route configurations and all that. But here you can actually test the route guard fully step by step, like what's going to happen. I'm going to try to route or navigate. Then I see a login page. Then I click login or enter my credentials, click login, and now I should be at the real route. You can test that with an end-to-end test, but now you can also test it with an integration test using the Angular testing library and Spectacular. So yeah, I think that's really nice. Like that's where it really shines, where you're doing a multi-step test case, a very complex one that would be pretty difficult to do like in in test bed without some of these helpers here. And it would be easier to do with end-to-end, but then it would be slower, and you couldn't have the flexibility to replace individual services, or maybe you want to remove some of the route guards and focus on just one of them or something like that. And again, the speed at which it happens. So Wallaby here is telling me right now that this test case is 286 milliseconds. Did I feel is there speed on this one? 81 milliseconds. So I think this one has like the startup cost. Also, Wallaby is running in a special way, so these numbers are not always trustworthy. But yeah, it gives you kind of the idea about it's definitely slower than an isolated unit test, but still it's pretty fast, right? Like below 100 milliseconds for testing all of this code and basically almost all the code in my repo. That's pretty good. Okay, so here back to my issue. It isn't firing a request, it seems. So I think my issue is that some time has to pass before that request is sent. The effect says 0 seconds, so that effect should be triggered initially, but still it's happening outside of the first VM turn or something. So trying now to use the fake async helper from Angular core testing, see if that can help me out. Then I need probably tick 0, tick 10. No, that's not it. Okay. So now I'm in trouble because now I don't really know what's going on. Yeah. Okay, so one thing I could do right now is just trying to debug here. So I could do the Angular HTTP client. Except if that one is replaced by the HTTP client testing module, and I'm not sure, but I don't think so. I think it's some of its dependencies being replaced. But okay, so I kind of have an issue because I wanted to replace this with a spy or spy on it before it was called, right? That was kind of my thinking right now. Delete this one, by the way. To do that, I would have to provide it up here. Yeah, okay. So now, now I'm actually going to look into whether this my own HTTP this one, my own HTTP client, whether that is ever called. It also has a method called get. So in our integration test suite, let us replace it now, hopefully temporarily, but see if it's being called at the time I expect here. So provide. What's going on? This one. Oh, that's actually, yeah, okay, so here's an issue. That one is not exported. I kept it internal to my data access library, so I actually wouldn't be able to replace that. So I do have to replace on the HP client level, unless I exported it from this library only for the purpose of testing. I would like to avoid to do that. Okay, what are you saying, Matteo? The mark is not taken into account. Yes, the spectacular feature testing module is not setting up any providers except for these two spectacular feature router and spectacular feature location. Those are the only, well, it's also configuring the router testing module, so you shouldn't be doing that yourself. That's the whole purpose of that one. But yeah, the providers, as I'm trying to do here, the providers for render, that should be picked up by your tests. And let's see if I can make that work. So instead, I'm going to replace the HTTP client, then use value. And I'm going to make a really dumb HTTP client here. HTTP spy. Which will be a partial of the HTTP client. Yeah. What else does it need? It's unhappy. Why is it unhappy? URL, some options. Oh, also, there should be a just function. Yeah, okay. So if I provide that instead of the real HTTP client by Angular, I should be able to leave this one out temporarily, and then I can't inject the controller, but I should be able to see now, or wait, I have to store this in a shared variable first. HTTP spy, which is a partial HTTP client, and then assigning it here instead. Okay. I was just thinking whether any of this is async, but it's not. So no. Okay, now I can check here whether expect PHP spy but get to have been called. No, it hasn't been called. So HTTP client hasn't been called. So now I'm kind of, I haven't, sorry, this was blocking the view a little bit. And down here, hopefully didn't miss anything because I was working up here. Yeah, so it's saying actually that we expected it to have at least one call, but it hasn't been called. The get method on the HTTP client, the Angular HTTP client, has not been called right now. So what's going on? I have no idea. I have no idea right now. There's something like, yeah, I actually don't know. So, okay, there's one thing. I think that Wallaby can help me out here. It has this thing called the testing story. I can click that, and it will walk me through. It will show me here every piece of code that is called by that whole this test case. I think including the setup. So every code that has been executed as part of this test. So it starts here even with the imports of well, first here in the integration spec, and then this forecast module, the container component, the index of this forecast store. The forecast store has some imports, so it goes all the way, right? Let's go down to some code here. Let's get down to some actual code rather than import statements. Okay, here we are. Store. It's just initializing some variables in the class. Here now we're in the forecast component. It's initializing a component class, setting a getter here, or is it actually calling it? Okay, so we're inside of the container component. It's importing the scam for the forecast component. So that's why we're getting into this file. Now we're back in the container component to finish declaring its class. Now we're at the routes in the forecast CO2 forecast feature module. And it's looking for the route path, CO2 route path. Here it is. It found it. Now, finally, we're getting to the test suite here. We're now defining our shared variables, calling like the setup function here, setting up the test cases, and here we go. Yeah, so now we're getting to the executed test code. We have our before each, that's our test setup. So it's calling render. It is now creating this HTTP client. Now it's creating the Angular HTTP client, which should be our spy instead of the real one. Now we're in the Danish date store to set the initial state to the start of the current Danish day. Now we're in the CO2 forecast store, initializing an initial state. And this is requesting or resolving our own HTTP client, this one. And we're calling the effect here. Is there some code? Now we're in the forecast component. Okay, so it is requesting. So it is now requesting the forecast state property from the forecast store. Okay, so now we're at now we're at the test. Now we're at the arranged test step of our test case, and everything failed. So we didn't get to trigger the effect yet, which is this one. We have been where it's actually passing an observable to this effect. So this seems like, yeah, today, we're getting today from here. Yeah, but the effect hasn't, like, we should get further, like we should get down to the switch map calling the HTTP client. So we haven't really gotten into the effect yet at this point. And now I don't really know. Let's try to step to the next one, but it will fail. Rather, it is failing. So I can't step. Oh, here. Step over. Okay, so now we're here where it will be failing. Right. Can't do anything more than this. But I can take the Wallaby tools. So now I can see the HTTP spy here. Here it is with our mock. And the mock has 0 calls. Okay, so it definitely hasn't been called yet. Ending this test story with the debugger. And Matteo, you're wondering if you can do everything with the harness that you can do with the feature testing module. Yes, the create feature harness from the function from Spectacular. It's imports the feature testing module and does some more work. Like, it's initializing by navigating to the default route of the feature module, and then it's waiting for the whole thing to stabilize. So that's what it does when you use it, the create feature harness instead of the feature testing module directly. But when you're going to combine it with other libraries, you're probably going to need the feature testing module. At least with Angular testing library. Yes, yeah. Well, one more thing that the create feature harness does. Yeah, it does bootstrap the whole app and uses the Spectacular app component as the root component. So yeah, it does some of the same things as Angular testing library, but then you don't have all the helpers for interacting with the DOM and querying the DOM. So you're going to need to use testbed directly for that, as you might have been used to from Angular component tests using the testbed. So, but yeah, it can work without Angular testing library, without component harnesses. It can work on its own with Angular testbed, and just to create feature harness function. And maybe a tick to let the effect be executed. Yes, that was what I tried before. Make async. We can try to do both tick, and we can do flush, and the whole thing, because I don't remember right now which one is doing what. Still, no success. Yeah, I do highly suggest that you use Spectacular together with Angular testing library or Angular component harnesses from CDK and Material. But you can use it just with the testbed. It is an independent library, but it integrates well. I'm talking about Spectacular here, the feature testing API. It integrates well with Angular testing library because it will never have all these nice APIs for working with the DOM. And the testing library has been evolving over years. So why reinvent the wheel in Spectacular? Instead, Spectacular is focusing on setting up the testbed for working with a whole feature module, all the routes, all the services and components represented by that routed feature module. Okay, so it's definitely getting way past my my bedtime now, so I can't really figure out what's going on here. Why that component store is not triggering its effect yet. There's something I'm missing, right? I mean, I can try to find the store. I can go into store if I can find it. CO2 store. And like I can do, well, we saw that this was being called. So if I open up Wallaby down here and I do, let's say, hi, should turn up here, right? Before effect, init, after. Yeah, it is being called a few times after. And even if I focus only on this test, this is a Wallaby feature, could do the same thing by writing it.only or f it or fit. But when I do it with Wallaby, I'm not leaving traces in the code, so I'm not committing something accidentally that disables other tests. So I can click here, focus, and now that's the only test being run. So when I see the console log outputs here, it's from that. It's because of that one test. So what could I else do? I could also go in here and say tab. Now I could use a nice debug operator, who was the person that created that one from the community. Can't remember right now, but values. So whenever this is triggered, and I can actually see here from Wallaby that we never reached this point of the code. It's grayed out, meaning it was not touched by any test running right now. So we're never getting to this point. So what if I disable this assertion and go all the way down here? Is the code then triggered? No. If I disable these assertions? No, you never get to executing this code, it seems. So yeah, I have no idea. Is it this timer? Is it this timer that's not being started? Do I need a test scheduler or something? Oh, well, I'm glad to be of help, Matteo. I knew you have been asking about Spectacular, so hopefully this can give you some inspiration and another video that you can go and look at. And of course, this is, let me push it now. The working test and the setup is also in the Energy Insights repo in this feature branch for the CO2 forecast. So yeah, I don't really know where I'm like, maybe I need a test scheduler for RX for this timer to work, or is this something special I need to do with component store? It's a little strange because wasn't that effect working? No, I guess it wasn't. It wasn't working in the other test because there was like the container component test. I was providing the store. Why was it providing the store, by the way? It is already provided here. So that's, oh, because I was testing it as a container component. I wasn't calling create component. So I was basically testing it without any DOM. But even in this test, I think I was controlling the state of the component store here by calling set state on it rather than, oh, here I'm doing tick 0. Yeah, I was controlling the internal state directly rather than waiting for any effects to do HTTP requests. So here I was kind of stubbing the store, not using how the store actually works, not like the effect. I was kind of ignoring the effect and doing the setup myself. So, I mean, I could do the same thing here inside of this test and go and give the CO2 forecast store some data, but then it wouldn't be much of an integration test. I mean, then I would be testing the component again, but not the store with the effects, not the HTTP client. So yeah, it would still be an integration test because it's testing multiple components and all the way to the DOM of them, and navigation as well. But I would be leaving out a huge portion of my code, the CO2 forecast store with the state and the effect to call the HTTP client and my own HTTP client. So I really want to cover all of those classes with these integration tests, so that I'm testing basically everything as close as possible to how it would be used in production. So without replacing any classes with fakes and stubs, as much as possible. So yeah, where is this going wrong? I don't really know. I mean, I had been thinking about that maybe let's delete this, whatever I put in here. I've been thinking about that, but this is not a good way to initialize an effect from a testing standpoint. because I would like to be able to control it more granularly, like not starting the effects or starting the effects when I say so. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's a pattern for this in Component Store, maybe not. One thing I have been thinking about is what if I gave it like an I can't spell, but like an initialize function here that would actually initialize the effect. First, I would need to something like this. But then, of course, this would need to be called in the application and in the test. How could I do that? I could use an application initializer, maybe. But still, like, yeah, still thinking about whether that's a good idea. Also, in this integration test, it shouldn't be necessary. It should just work as like in the app. So I shouldn't have the need in the integration test to control when the effect is actually triggered. That should just happen as in like seamlessly as in the real app. It shouldn't be necessary to touch these things. But maybe it is this RxJS timer that I need. It needs a test scheduler or something. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm going to have to sleep on it, or maybe ask some clever people, some smart people for help on this RxJS testing thing. But it might be I need a RxJS test scheduler or something. It's definitely like how can I get to the next point in time to start triggering this timer? And this timer is not being triggered, and this next step in the observable pipeline is not reached until both of these observables have emitted at least once. And we saw that the Danish Today observable that we get from here, that has emitted. But the timer seems to be the issue. Combined latest waits for at least one emission from both of these before going down the pipeline here. So yeah, probably the timer of RxJS is the issue here. But we have seen this timer working in its test, actually. We have seen it here. I think I'm still filtering out on this test. Now I'm running all tests again. So the test for this store, we are actually seeing here that we can control the effect using fake async and then tick. Here it's tick 0, then the initial effect is running, which I'm like, why doesn't this work in our other test here? I'm not sure. And here it's tick and then a minute's worth of milliseconds. And then we can see that HTTP get spy has been called again. So here we have actually seen this, like and then this discard periodic task. But here we have seen the effect running in the test, controlling the time in the test by using fake async and tick. So why is it not working in here? Oh, wait. This fake async, is it getting it from the right place? Yeah, it is. Okay, good. From Angular core testing. But this should be enough. This is the same as I had here in the forecast store test. Did I have anything special inside of the setup function? Oh yeah, okay. Oh. Well, we're it should of course receive something from HTTP, but I'm still wondering. This timer should trigger no matter what. Then it should go down here. And then it needs the response from HTTP, our own HTTP. So it still seems like the timer is not being triggered. What if I run through the test story of this one? Let me see what that looks like. Let's go down here. Now we're at this point of the test story. Let's actually go to the next line. Check. Oh, circle back. Okay, step. If I step over and then step into, what's going to happen? Okay, so this tick 0 is triggering the next step in the observable pipeline, the map here, and then it goes on to call the HTTP client. This is what we're not seeing in our integration test suite for some reason. Tick 0 triggers the effect. Okay, let's try to get into our setup and see what's going on here. Step into configuring. We're getting our HTTP client, which is getting the Angular HTTP client. Okay, we're then replacing it with a SPI, the get method. Then we're injecting the store. So then at that time it's being created, which should start the effect very soon. Oh, this is the date store, Danish date store. I'm looking for the CO2 forecast store. Here it is. It's now being initialized. Here's its constructor. Oh, and now, okay, now it's creating the effect property. And I'm looking for, oh, here it is. Yeah. Now it's being initialized inside the constructor of the CO2 forecast store. So to do that, it is getting the value here from the Danish date store. And now we're back from the setup and getting to the tick. Yeah, this is what I expected. But why is it not happening inside of here? That's my question. Well, you did say something about your providers not working. So am I? No, that's not my problem here. Because the effect is never triggered. That's my problem. And I really don't know why. I mean, this integration test is using a lot of other things that was not used in that unit test for the CO2 forecast store. This one is using Spectacular. It's using the Angular testing libraries. So there's a lot of things going on here. Routing as well. Okay. Well, I definitely have to sleep on this. and figure out like what's the issue here. So yeah, important things today. We saw how to, now I've messed it up a bit, but in the repo you'll see how to set up like the spectacular with the Angular testing module. It goes something like this. This bit here, that's the setup, something like the setup you're going to need for integration testing with Spectacular and Angular testing library. So for this integration test, it's testing this routed feature module from an NX feature library for the Angular app we have here. And we're giving it the route path, which is CO2. So it's the same as is being used in the application, which gets rid of some issues. And then we can test. So yeah, I'm going to add back some of these things here. Yeah, so that's the most important learning. We saw how to use Angular testing library for a very basic thing here. And now we're getting into some issues with the router, or sorry, our NGX component store. So I'm going to have to do some more experiments here some other time. Unfortunately, this was my last episode. I have now used up all my free StreamYard streaming minutes, and I will only get more 3 weeks from now, the 17th of June. So this is a cliffhanger. I'm sorry, very sorry for that. I'll be working on some other things until then, and then I'll see you again in 3 weeks' time. So that's it for today, NX After Dark. I hope you learned something or anything from any of this. Hopefully some inspiration to look into some of the different technologies here. And have a great day or a great week, depending on your time of day. See you. Bye.